Good afternoon. My name is Rahma Hassan. I am a student here at IAC doing my MA1 program. So this next session, we are now moving to the fourth session of the day, Public Space Design for Africa. And I'll quickly introduce our next guest. So here we have Mokena Makeka from South Africa that will be giving us a short presentation on the subject. So quick introduction: he's from South Africa and principal at Dahlberg Advisors, and also the creative director of Makeka Design Lab. He is committed to social transformation in cities of spatial and ecological justice. He has also led work in Lesotho, Madagascar, Tanzania, South Africa, and China. And yep, so you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. Let me start by sharing the screen. Just be patient with me. It's the challenge of having many windows open. Just need to find my deck. Great. Can everybody see that?
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. So first of all, thanks to the organizers for having me here. Looking forward to sharing some reflections about architecture and public space. I thought that I would locate the discussion really in the context of the work that I've done, some of the work that I've done. So these ideas are not necessarily definitive about what public space looks like on the African continent, but definitely a particular perspective, and that'll be unpacked as we go forward. Just to locate my logo, it's a left-hand symbol, and it's a left hand over Southern Africa, with the country of Lesotho also denoted there. It's partly because in many ways there's arguments that show this is where the cradle of humanity began, and there's a whole lecture that I actually give around the origin of creative thought and abstract thinking and writing, and how that goes basically is the origin of architecture if we think about Plato's cave, etc. But really what really anchors it for me is this phrase "Levoy Искусство," which is actually a Russian constructivist statement, which means leftist art. It came out of the early 20th century, and it was really a statement about the right for architecture to be radical, to be inventive, to be provocative, and to be very thoughtful. Obviously, this came on the back of the Bolshevik Revolution, and I thought there were many similarities between this and my experience in post-1994 South Africa, where we were caught up in this wave of trying to reinvent a South African identity, and to many extents contributing to the larger puzzle of what does an African identity look like, particularly in terms of artistic production. So I'll take you through a few projects, as I mentioned. This is a medium-sized project I did for Sand Parks, South African National Parks. They'd asked me to create a sort of arboretum, a sort of facility out in the Tokai Forest of the Western Cape, where the Sand Parks officials who take care of conservation will be able to meet and gather. So in many ways, this is a building which is actually somewhat private in some respects, because it's really an office block for these Sand Park staffs. But at the same time, it's also a public building because it sits within a public park setting, and it's a public funded entity and so on. So one of the things I wanted to demonstrate with this project is the sort of reconciliation of tension about this institutional question about what is public, not just the space, but also institutionally what is public. We had some interesting debates about the architecture of the building and its colors and its tonality and so on. Some people in Sand Parks believe that the building should disappear into the landscape, it shouldn't be visible. because that would be the appropriate public gesture. I made a counter argument largely around, climate change and heat reflection. I wanted a white building, which also had a strong relationship to the Cape Dutch vernacular architecture, but more importantly, that to be public doesn't mean to be invisible. So that was another sort of subtext in terms of the architectural narrative. But sorry, let me take one step back. The original design, which I thought I would share, actually looked like this, and it's a series of different planes which are canted and have different topographies. So wall becomes ceiling and ceiling becomes wall and so on. And that's a sort of blurred landscape in which we're trying to push the boundaries of the sort of natural environment. Eventually, what we found is that the client felt that this was still perhaps I wouldn't say not perhaps, they struggled with this conception of a building that was very much organic, and they had this sort of public debate about what would sand parks look like in the public domain if we did that. So we came up with a very different strategy, but still notioned around the center of a courtyard, these sort of rectangular shapes, again, creating a sort of internal sort of public space and an external public space. And something to mention is that this building is located in a place where they were prone to attacks by baboons, which happens quite a bit. And there was this really interesting tension because on the one hand, Sun Parks positions itself as being part of nature, but the subtext of this whole architectural brief was to be apart from nature. So it was all about being closed off from context and somewhat privatized. So this project was really fascinating because of that tension between what was public and private. This is a design iteration number 2. Where you can start to see the geometries and the language of the building take on a sort of different sort of cadence, very much about still a sort of abstract linear element in the landscape, and that was an interesting journey from an institutional point of view. The next project that I'll share with you is MODILA. So I founded a museum a couple of years ago, a Museum of Design, Innovation, Leadership, and Art. And it was pretty much a precursor, if you will, of another museum that I'm going to share just now. And the argument was really about how do we take public art and public architecture and how do we project it in terms of a museum of design, particularly because Africa globally is not necessarily associated with design or museums that are projecting the future. When people think of Africa, they think of Africa in the past. They don't think of Africa in a future sense. So what I decided to do quite deliberately was to be provocative about these sorts of tropes, if you will. The building was inspired and informed by an African star constellation, the Silema star constellation, that was then pixelated and taken through a parametric program to form the sort of apertures on the actual building. The form of the building is a sort of crystalline structure, which is reflective of the crystal granite composition of Table Mountain. But I also wanted to make a deliberate statement that when we talk about architecture in Africa, it doesn't have to be nostalgic or trapped in the past, that we can actually claim the future through our architectural production. And this phrase, Homo situs 2.0, is actually from an amazing Moroccan philosopher who unfortunately died, Al-Zawahiri, who spoke about Homo situs, and it's the idea of situated man or situated humanity, that what makes a human being is their specific context and their specific location. So I took this idea, overlaid it with this question of urban acupuncture at the scale of the body, but imagining the body also as the city. And then these sort of fractal unfolded sort of geometries coming from the crystalline structure became a sort of determinant behind the design. The layout, very narrow site. I think it was roughly 45 meters wide by about 220 meters long, roughly. So, very linear conditions. And it's also about the interior spaces being a series of fractal geometries occupying the internal space. And then surrounding it, I developed a sort of more traditional urban design framework of buildings that would offset the cost of producing the museum. So there was also a whole business exercise here, looking at how much revenue could be generated by unlocking real estate in the surrounding area, and then seeing how that capital could then be subsidize the museum proper. And here are some close-up renders of the building itself there. And that's it in context on the site. the landowner chose to put up an office block on the site. So you're not able to find this building there. This is one of these interesting explorations of the architect, which don't realize fruition. The next one I wanted to share with yourself is the East Pier Precinct. And this is a portion also in Cape Town, close to the V&A waterfront, where in the V&A waterfront is probably Africa's most successful tourism facility, believe it or not, with millions of people who come there every year. More people come to this place than to the pyramids in Giza, which maybe speaks a lot about consumerism and our conception of public art and heritage, but that's a different takeaway. So with this opportunity, this part of the V&A waterfront, the V&A waterfront as a whole, was always seen as separate to the city. So it wasn't seen as part of the public space of the city or the public realm. And they on hand said that they actually see themselves as an extension of the urban fabric, if you will. So when this opportunity came up to create a new sort of infrastructure, really at the tail end of the harbor, it started to trigger some opportunities for what could a new public building look like. And I was asked to design a theater multi-purpose facility that would essentially extend the public realm right to the edge of the water. So there was a sort of urban design framework, as you can see there, with the different components and different activities that I'd allocated. There was a hotel, there's a Cape Agulhas docking point. I think it's the only place that you can go to Antarctica, aside from South America. It's actually just off this location. So very interesting from a scientific expedition point of view. And here you'll see the building just on the right-hand side, which I called Scenarium. And Scenarium was also this play on the notion of seeing and being seen. So I said, it's not an auditorium. It's not just a music hall. It's a scenario, but it's a place of performance and engagement. And the way that this building works is that essentially it has a skin, a sort of brise-soleil that wraps around it, but it's actually fractalized. And it's fractalized partly because there's an adjacent helicopter port next to it. So we had to break down the decibel volume of the helicopters so that the interior spaces could still be functional. And there's a series of a sort of unfolding sequence of spaces within the design itself. And then you can begin to see on the top right-hand image, this notion of this sort of broken up facade with this essentially a sort of interior public world that happens inside it that's kind of buffered from the noise on the surrounding context. This was a day shot and a night shot. Okay, the mouse is moving fairly quickly. I'll just go back quickly. That's a day shot there. This is a night shot of the same design. GREENPOINT Stadium. Now, I was also shortlisted to do a design for the World Cup when South Africa was hosting World Cup. So as you know, every country gets the opportunity to either refurbish their stadiums or to create new ones. Cape Town decided to create a new one, and we're part of a shortlisted competition. The site was quite interesting because GREENPOINT Common, if you will, was a site that has a whole range of histories. It was used as a concentration camp during the time of Queen Victoria. It was a place of lots of conflict where also indigenous people were held against their free will. It's currently it was a marketplace at the time, and also it has this relationship towards Robben Island. And Robben Island is fairly famous in South Africa's landscape because that's the place where Nelson Mandela and many other people were imprisoned, not just recently, but it's always been a place of imprisonment for the last couple of 100 years. So this was a site where I was quite intrigued about how do we map a stadium and sport in connection with heritage and so on. So it's also about this public space and this public imagination of history, created a sort of framework for how the urban landscape would work. That sort of red diagonal is a line that actually connects all the way to Robben Island. The sort of yellow crescent is where some of the major vistas are, which are on the outside of the space. And then because the whole public park is lined by housing on the outer edge, it creates quite a sort of cloistered sort of mega urban room, if you will. And then of course a series of green spaces layering Here's the sort of schematic diagram of what the stadium did. And it's actually quite a radical design, because what I did is I actually split the stadium in two, so that when you're inside the public arena of the stadium, you're constantly aware of Robben Island. So it's a way of connecting the inside to outside. Most stadiums are entirely enclosed spaces. They don't have a relationship to the context once you're inside it, because of the importance of the spectacle. The form was inspired by the protea flower, which is the national flower of South Africa, the rolling landscapes, the notion of an African tree, which provides comfort and shade, and then the beadwork and craft work. And what I did is I came up with this concept of these leaves, if you will, like the protea leaf, that actually creates inside and outside space. So in other words, on the outside of the space, underneath the raking of the seating, there's an opportunity to have a market and a marketplace. So you could still have sports happening, but the outside of the facility becomes this space of public interaction. There you can see the cut in the building where the seats have been removed, and the timber slats actually continue to give a sort of filtered view inside and out. And that's what the overall impression of what the museum would have looked like. And I think in many ways it starts to challenge this conception about what is urban, what's African, what's architecture, but also what is history. Next project, and I'll move on fairly quickly because I'm conscious of time. I was invited by Herzog and de Meuron, alongside with 19 other architects, to design a villa in Inner Mongolia a number of years ago. Quite an amazing project, actually. And one of the things that struck me about this project was there was the creation of a new city. ORDOS is a new city from scratch, and it had this sort of housing component. So how do you create a new public domain in a city which does not exist before? And one of the things that I did very, very early on, and here you can see the sort of rectangular form there, and that sort of gray ribbon that pulls to the side is the public realm. There was a lottery that was held. I was lucky to actually find a site that was adjacent to the public realm. And what I wanted to do was actually invert the design. Now, what I mean by that is, I'm not sure if you know about traditional Chinese residential construction. They have what's called a hutong. So a hutong is basically a courtyard form in which the internal part of the courtyard acts as the public space. So in other words, all the adjoining spaces, or rather residential units, come out into that courtyard, and they see that as their living room. So that public space is almost a private space in the Western sense, but it's a public space in the Chinese sense. Now, I was intrigued by this idea because from around 2006 to around 2010 and so on, Beijing and other cities wanted to modernize, so they decided to remove these hutongs. So they were starting to erase their historical fabric. Which I thought was quite sad. So I decided to take this pavilion, and I pivoted and said that I'll create a contemporary version of the hutong. So it's essentially a sort of C-shaped architectural form in which the internal space, which from a Western eye might seem private, is actually public. And I pulled through a pedestrian desire line all the way through the building, and that made it a bit of a political statement. You can see here the sort of green ribbon as described. You can see the little gray and sort of Core-10 block on that side and the sort of gash going through it. That was to encourage movement. And then I spoke with my neighbors, my other architectural counterparts, about connecting their entrances through my building and across to other spaces. So it became a very different sort of urban strategy for what a building could look like. So you hear the statement, the green belt, which is the public realm, is used as an external art exhibition space that warps and wraps under the building, luring people into a semi-private world where the creative sector is brought into the life of the home. And the whole bottom floor of this house is conceived as an art gallery. So it was a way of connecting art and the public and getting a movement through the building, and the private activities happen on the upper level. Concept of the building was line, solid, void. So that was how I split up the components of the strategy. There you can begin to see, in terms of the lining, how the public and private realm begins to intersect with the forms and the volumes, where public and private are almost always in intense adjacencies and not seen as separate and cloistered, but actually continuous. And here's that view of that space. And here's a quick sort of section through the through that part of the volume, although the actual gas is running in this sort of direction on this view. But really fascinating project because it was a statement about the erasure of China's past. It paid homage to the Hutong structure, which has been a sort of almost iconic form of residency for hundreds of years, but at the same time was very much a sort of modern building in terms of how it was structured. And here, unfortunately, the one person is standing right in front of my model. This was curated, by the way, by the world famous artist Ai Weiwei. He was the curator of all of these, of this gathering. And you can begin to see the distinctive design there. And I was one of 2 architects from Africa out of the 100. So it was really fascinating looking at the sort of mosaic of how different architects from around the world are thinking about urban form and residency. In Khayelitsha, which is a township in Cape Town, I was asked to do a multi-purpose community center. Khayelitsha is, I'm sure we know the challenges of slum settlements throughout the continent. Khayelitsha is one of our largest slums in Cape Town, experiencing ongoing development, but still really challenged in many ways. And I decided to do a number of things with this particular project. The one is that to make a very clear architectural investment in terms of that landscape, because what would happen is that the government would underinvest in these facilities because they don't pay that much taxes and so on. So there was a very minimalist approach about how do you intervene in townships. These townships are vulnerable to fire annually, as well as flooding, and also a sense of disconnect with the city. And government. So I actually wanted to make a building that felt resilient, that felt strong, that felt that it would sit in the landscape, that it wouldn't collapse under fire, and that was also a sign of commitment. So the strategy was somewhat different. And just to give you a sense of Cape Town, where I live, Cape Town has some of the most expensive real estate in Africa, literally 20 kilometers, 50 kilometers away from some of the poorest parts of the continent. So it's really a place of really stark contrasts. I did an urban design framework because when I was given a site, there was no coordination about what the site would look like. So again, I did what I call anticipatory architecture. So that's about how do you make a building that creates public space, but also gives clues for other people to develop their own public spaces. Here you can see the sort of off-shutter concrete facade of the building on the one side. When it was designed, there was no need for any fencing, which again was almost unheard of. Everybody said you need fences in the township. I said, no, we need public space in the township. So it was much more about that sort of thinking. That's a sort of night shot. You can see also no burglar bars, no protection. Yes, it was shatterproof glass, but I also wanted that the urban experience felt somewhat seamless. This is a shot of it during the day. Excuse the fuzziness of this image. You can see it's even before the road had been put in. So it was very, very early days. And that whole facade actually opens up so that basically the public square, which you're standing in right now, actually flows into the building. So it was also a statement that the building could participate in doubling public space by actually having one facade that actually dematerializes. That's a shot of it in the evening. And then next project, and perhaps more recent, I was asked, I don't know, this thing is moving, forgive me. Okay, this is a very eager presentation. I just wanted to say that with this particular project, I'll actually keep it on here. That museum that I mentioned earlier before, Museum of Design, actually led to, it actually triggered a lot of thought about more contemporary museum for Cape Town, to the point that Thomas Heatherwick was then asked to do a renovation of the silos. So there was this growing understanding that museums can be contemporary, so they selected him as the architect. I was asked to be the architect for a housing unit adjacent to it, as well as a sort of urban precinct planner. And about 72 odd units that we had to erect on that side. But what's fascinating about it, and there you can see the grain silo that was built in 1921 in the blue, very solid building with these sort of adjacent components, looking at the public realm. I then created a Nolly map, looking at what are all of the public spaces, both inside the building and outside. And you can begin to see there in the central form, how originally that whole ground plane of the museum becomes accessible, and towards the sort of east, if you will, that that building which I worked on also has quite a dematerialized ground plane. So a Nolly plan is nothing new, although some people think a Nolly plan is a figure ground plan. There are differences. It's not a figure ground plan. A Nolly plan is actually a public space realm drawing, and I do it on all of my designs because it really begins to crystallize where the project is going. Here's a model of the actual project, and here's the housing units that I did, and in the background you can see the actual museum itself. And again, this project begins to articulate a sort of new public realm within the V&A waterfront, residential spaces, roof spaces, rooms, and so on. Then you can see the building in a bit more detail. And then last but not quite least, I was asked to do some work in Madagascar to create an ICT hub for the Ministry of Telecommunications and so on. And really fascinating project, because here we were looking at what could an ICT hub do within the city, what's the type of impact that it could achieve. And essentially the form that I created was also one where it's quite a prominent site in Antananarivo, but looking at the pedestrian circulation systems and so on, and creating a very different type of urban form in which, by pushing and pulling the actual layout, you create both different types of public space, right? Public space that is almost U-shaped, others that are more linear, trapped, you know, so it gave a lot of language and diversity of the public space realm. There you can see the layout and how we structured it, composed of about 7 different buildings, the main building being the one that you can see towards your left. Studies about the skin, and here are some renders of the building, and you can see here how even the public realm happens on 2 different levels. So what I decided to also do was to elevate the one portion of the public realm to come up to the first floor, and then another one that goes underneath. And for me, it's all about providing spatial complexity and spatial nuance to this definition of what is public. But it's not a building that hugs the street with a palisade fence and only leaves a sidewalk. In many ways, the sidewalk becomes this super sort of public realm within the building. And last but not least, the Gabon Tower, my most recent work, where I've been asked to create a tower for the government of Gabon to house the UN. And here, slightly different conditions. It's complex. The UN is not a public entity in the sense that you have diplomats and so on. There's safety, security issues. It's a highly sensitive building. So what I did here was actually, again, made a ground plane that was accessible, and the rest of the building is far much more private, if you will. But what makes this building unique is that I replaced 85% of the concrete and steel with a recommendation for local woods to be used. So we also managed to get down the carbon profile of this building and save about 1.5 million tons of CO2 through its construction. And here are different views of the building, and that's the final representation. And what intrigues me about this sort of language of a building is it's the sort of lattice framework, which I think is an incredible evolution from the sort of heavy sort of concrete stereoatomic mass buildings that I've shown earlier in my portfolio. But what's interesting about this project is that, you know, the UN is another type of public space. Like, it's another institution, it's another you know, global body in which conversations about different forms of public are being convened. What I've tried to do in this presentation was to demonstrate that I think public space takes on a number of dimensions. It's institutional, it is urban, it is architectural, it's also political, and it's also historical. And I think from that perspective, we can start to deepen understanding of what does it mean on the African continent. I think what we take with those layers in different locations is what makes it place specific, going back to my point about Homo situs, and also what makes it you know, uniquely African. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Mokena, for this presentation. It was was pretty great, and we really got to see how the design of public spaces could be explored in Africa. I think we might already be a little short on time, but just maybe a couple of questions before we end this this session. So I know you already talked about how these public spaces can be designed in the African context, but one question that I have for you is how can we emphasize to our governments and citizens the importance of public spaces in our cities, especially whenever you just mentioned how these spaces are important in the political context, for example.
So I mean, for me, public space is political, right? And what I mean by political, I don't necessarily mean political party, but I mean political in the sense that this is where people gather publicly to debate and I have ideas. So yes, on the one hand, it could be like the World Cup, it's about sport and celebration. But on the other hand, it's about protest. It's about gathering. You know, I mean, if you look at what happened in Tiananmen Square in China, for example, and how that public space naturally became the focal point for a political discourse. You could also say the same for the Arab or African Spring, in which how public space was then used, and even how data and technology became an alternative public space for convening. So I think for me, the thing is, you know, when we say, you know, how do we, I think it's about how do we create the spaces for politics. That's what I mean by public space. So it's not just, okay, are there nice benches? You know, are there good trees? Politics is where you allow different people to encounter each other. So how do you make this a place where it doesn't feel like it's owned only by the wealthy, or it's a place that's only for the poor, or it's a place that's only for business people? It's like, it's their business space. So a public space in its truest sense is a place where multiple discourses are made tangible, right? And I think what we have to do in our cities is we have to be very vigilant for when these spaces get eroded. So often we will find, I look at cities and I often can tell the state of its democracy by the extent to which it invests in public space. In South Africa, for example, our parliament has increasingly reduced the public domain to a sidewalk because they don't want protests in front. Now, it might be argued as a safety and security issue, but I actually think that that's an erosion of the public realm. I also find that in other places, sometimes public squares are getting reduced and made smaller and smaller, probably for profit and so on, which is, you know, there's value in that. But I do think if it comes at the expense of gathering, of joy, of contestation, of citizenship, then we've got a problem. So I do think public space is intimately connected to the body politic. And I think progressive societies ensure that they have safe public spaces where these adjacencies can occur.
Okay, thank you for the answer. I guess I can check on the chat if there's any more questions, and I guess if not, I can ask one last question, and then we might need to end the session. So as a last question, I would like to ask you how, well, what would these public spaces look like in that specific, well, African context, and what are the needs to have these type of places in the same context or in different contexts?
Okay, I'm gonna try and answer that question. I'm not sure I fully get it, but I would say a couple of things. One is that they have to be cultural spaces, right? So that's what makes public space public. So I think we have to look at what is the culture of a particular place and locale. And there's certain things which certain cultures feel are private, and that's fine. But there's certain activities which have to be public. The problem that many African cities have is that because of our training in the main, there's a temptation to replicate a Western city, but the Western city is built on Western cultural practices, as opposed to saying, what are the African cultural practices and what can we learn from the Western city? So for example, I think of events such as, in sub-Saharan Africa, the slaughtering of sheep for family events, etc., and so on, is a very public event. But in our urban centers, that is deemed to be something that happens only in the Black areas of the township. So what that means is that for the vast majority of citizens, when they occupy their cities, they're not fully occupying it with their cultural repertoire. They're suppressing it. There's things that they will say, oh, we do this in the village, and there are things that we'll do in town. Now, I think that there's room for us to redefine for ourselves, what do we do in our public spaces? And there needs to be dialogue about it, notwithstanding health and safety issues and various lobbies about whether it's animal cruelty, whatever it might be. I mean, you can take your pick of concerns. My point is that until we think of our public culture, our culture as a public activity, we will always think of public space as a place which is devoid of culture, right? It's not about cultural practices, it's about how we're projecting ourselves, whereas a really political space in the African sense will allow our culture to be in those sorts of places. And I think of the Greek agora as an example of it's a well-studied space, and we have many African examples, but here was a space which was bound by faith on the one hand, authority on the other side, and then I think commerce on the other, right? So it was both a marketplace, it was also a place of authority, and it was a place of religion. That's what made the Agora so successful, because it had these three different tensions, three different body politics occupying the same space, but that public space was all of those things. It was trading, it was faith, and it was authority. Now, when we think about what are the components of African culture and African space, we need to see the space as more than its physical form, but the space where these different body politics can come together. So that can be anything. It might be different in Zanzibar to Addis Ababa to Lagos to Cape Town. The question is, when we as architects, are we cognizant of what are those body politics that have a right to occupy the public space in that particular context? Because I don't think there's a one size fits all, this is African public space. I think that goes against my earlier thesis about homo situs, situated humanity. What is your situation? Where are you in? And how do you elevate the culture of a particular place and give it the dignity it deserves to be by making it public, as opposed to suppressing it and keeping it in the background.
Thank you so much, Mokena. That was a really enlightening conversation. So unfortunately, we just ran out of time. So thank you again for this session, and hopefully we'll be able to connect again.
All good. Hope it was helpful. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.